But we should understand them, and we should argue about them, and we should measure them, and then we should figure out how to right the injustices of the past and help more people become more prosperous in a way that's consistent with the planet staying sustainable and obviously not overheating.
I wonder, Simon, how does the growth of China fit into your thesis? The hope in the West, of course, was that economic liberalization would be accompanied by democratization. That hasn't happened. In recent years, China has doubled down on authoritarianism and still enjoyed growth. How does your thesis accommodate China?
So China is really interesting, Nick, and let me draw a contrast between the Chinese experience and what's in the data and what we see for Japan and also South Korea. So Japan after World War II was not a very rich country, and real wages of low-skilled workers were quite flat for a couple of decades, but then they started to grow, and by the 1980s, Japanese wages for low-skilled workers were about the same as in the United States. In South Korea, the story starts a little bit later, but it's very similar. During the 1960s, they have economic growth, but the low skilled don't do very well. In the 1990s and in the 2000s, they've done much better. They're not quite at the US-Japanese level. But if you look at the wages for low-skilled workers in China, this is well-established data. It's not my data. Data's been proven by other people. The wages of low-skilled workers are quite flat coming out of the 1980s, and they remain flat through into the 2010s. And after the 2010s, the early 2010s, you can't get that data anymore, Nick. And my understanding is that if you try to get that data, or you publish that data, or you write about the wages and living conditions of those same people, the low-skilled workers, you get into serious trouble in China. So the question I would ask, the question I ask everyone, the question I ask the Chinese, Nick, obviously I'm not saying anything to you, don't say to them directly, is, if this miracle, if this shared prosperity is genuine in China, if everybody has climbed up, why won't you show us the data?
Professor Johnson, I wonder how Donald Trump fits within your thesis. Here is somebody who has trashed democratic institutions in many ways, refusing to accept the results of the 2020 election, and yet he still stands a good chance of returning to the White House.
So here's the interesting thing, Nick. When our paper first came out, the big paper on colonial origins and on the importance of good institutions in 2001, it wasn't a partisan paper at all. I mean, we said you need property rights, people on the right like that. We said you need political voice, people on the left like that. So the paper really hit a nice sweet spot. I heard people this week say, oh my goodness, this prize has been awarded for this or that political agenda because it's so obviously anti-Trump. Well, that's just extraordinary. I mean, we were arguing for things and demonstrating the value of values that are absolutely intrinsic and inherent over hundreds of years in the United States and in Australia and in other countries that we've talked about. And there is a Trump factor, and we don't know how long that will last. So we don't know if it's just about him and just about this moment. We also don't know what happens if he loses and rejects the result of another free and fair election. It's an extremely dangerous moment for American democracy and therefore for the world.
Well, it certainly is. Professor Simon Johnson, it has been a pleasure to talk to you. Congratulations on winning the Nobel Prize for Economics.
Thank you very much.
That was Professor Simon Johnson, one of the recipients of this year's Nobel Prize. Well, the King of Australia has arrived down under. Charles III and Queen Camilla making their first visit since he assumed the throne to one of the 14 countries outside of the UK where he remains the head of state. He's returning to a land that had such a formative effect on him as a young man. King Charles has spoken wistfully of how he had the pommy bit bashed off me during the time he spent at the Timbertop campus at Geelong Grammar School in Victoria. But much has changed since then. He doesn't command the same affection as his late mother. Last year, First Nations people from around the Commonwealth penned a letter calling on him to apologise for centuries of racism and what they called the legacy of genocide perpetrated by the Crown. Well, with us to discuss his visit is one of Australia's foremost royal watchers, Juliette Reardon. Juliette, welcome to the studio.
Hello, Nick.
The King of Australia, it still sounds so jarring in some ways, doesn't it?
Well, I've sort of got used to it by now, so I can barely remember calling him Prince Charles. But yes, you're right. We knew him as Prince Charles for so very long, and he was waiting a long time for this moment, wasn't he?
And the King of Australia, I mean, that is his official title.
That is his official title. There's going to be an event that involves the Australian Great Seal, and that will be on there. King Charles III of Australia.
Well, the text line will be lighting up with Republicans any minute. Look, he speaks very fondly of Australia, doesn't he? He's been here 16 times before. He spent his time at the Timbertop campus. He does seem to have this affinity with Australia.
He does have an affinity with Australia. I think it all started with that 1966 trip to Australia as a student. He wasn't representing the royal family. He was completing his education. He'd had a pretty rough time at Gordonston, the school in Scotland that his father wanted him to go to.
A brutal school.
A brutal school. He was bullied there. He didn't quite get on with the energy there. He came to Australia for the first time really travelling overseas. And he was faced with this bank of photographers when he got off the plane. He's talked to me about that in the past. I did a long interview with him some years ago. And he talked about how weird it was to suddenly face this bank of people who wanted to speak to him. He'd never been out there doing that before. But of course, this was the start of his day job, really. And he sort of steeled himself, stepped out, and realised that once he got over the breach and could speak to them, he was in his element, because he loves talking to people, and he's basically never stopped talking to people ever since.
What's your sense of how King Charles will deal with this demand for an apology from First Nations leaders?
I think he'll take it in his stride. He'll be expecting it, of course. His advisors will have been talking to him about it for some time. He has a lot of affection for Australia, as we said, but also for the Indigenous people. The royal family greet the Indigenous people all the time. That became a part of tours for Queen Elizabeth, for his mother. And King Charles has met with lots of Indigenous elders over the years. I think he will understand. He's talked about it before. He's talked about understanding how the feeling of for First Nations people here, and he gave this speech back in his bicentenary speech back in 1988, and he said, for the original people of this land, it must have all seemed very different, and if they should say that their predicament has not yet ended, it will be hard to know how to answer, beyond suggesting that a country free enough to examine its own conscience is a land worth living in. So he knew, he knows, he gets it.
He's been sensitive to this for many years.
He's been sensitive. A difficult position for him, of course.
Yeah. Because there is this sense that he was disappointed with the outcome of the voice referendum.
Yes, I mean, he's not spoken about it, but I'm sure it matters to him, as it did to a lot of Australians. And I think, I wouldn't speak for the King at all, but I'm sure he understands what was going on there, and he is very much someone who likes to have harmony between people.
It was interesting you mentioned his 1988 speech at the bicentennial celebrations. I didn't realise this until I read Malcolm Turnbull's The Memoir, but that actually was the spark for the creation of the Australian Republican movement. Mm-hmm. There were Republicans in Australia who just thought it was so ludicrous that a Brit was at the heart of these celebrations and delivering such a keynote speech that they actually reacted to it by setting up the Australian Republican movement.
Yeah, I mean, that is interesting, isn't it? And I think that was a difficult moment for the King there, because it was, Australia Day, and to have the King there as the person who was talking, he was Prince Charles at the time, and talking on behalf, perhaps, of the Australian people. But, when you look back at that speech, he does understand all of that, and he does get it, and he's talking a lot about how wonderful Australia is and how wonderful Australians are. I mean, I found a bit in his naval journal back in